So this week we're doing a retro review, more specifically we're doing a retro review of Final Fantasy IV, a game that I very much enjoyed because it was from a time before Final Fantasy got lost up its own butthole. Like all the other Final Fantasies before it up until this point, Final Fantasy IV had been very much set in the swords and sorcery part of the fantasy genre, which means not much about its general setting will need to be explained to people unless you haven't opened a fantasy book in the last 40 fucking years. You play as Cecil, and yes, I am not joking, that is actually his name. A Dark Knight under the command of the Kingdom of Baron, the most powerful military force on the continent at that particular point in time, mostly because they have airships and everyone else doesn't. After a hard day of genociding the fuck out of another kingdom, because fuck those guys in particular, Cecil comes back to hand off the legendary magical crystal to the king he's sworn to serve. And immediately after he's done this, questions why those people needed to die in the first place considering they were pacifists. This being a fantasy setting, the king is extremely angry at being questioned and immediately sends Cecil off on a suicide mission accompanied by his best friend the Dragoon Commander Kain. The next day, Cecil and Kain head off to their destination, a misty mountain that has a village behind it that they need to deliver a certain ring to. It becomes apparent that the king had less than noble intentions from sending them because the ring they were given explodes and murders everyone around them except for them and one little girl, which they find out after they've killed the dragon apparition in the cave. They've accidentally also murdered the girl's mother in addition to everyone else she's ever known. Great job, lads! Understandably upset at this, the girl then summons forth a giant to smash the land into two pieces, her being a summoner and this being a very particular power that only a few people have. Cecil wakes up a short time later discovering that Kain is gone and the girl is still next to him, and then without even a thought kidnaps a small child whose mother is just killed and murdered everyone that she ever cared about. Which brings me to the point that Final Fantasy IV is incredibly fucked up, and unfortunately also missing some of the stuff that made the original and the GBA version so enjoyable. Because you see, while Final Fantasy IV is indeed incredibly fucked up, it was also incredibly fucked up in a very good way. At least originally. This version, while still excellent, does have a few problems that drag it down at least below the original in my opinion. The main problem for me was the lack of a conversation in the early game between Cecil and his love interest Rosa. In the original version of Final Fantasy IV, the two characters had an in-depth conversation where Cecil mentions that he's slowly losing his emotions in exchange for the power of a Dark Knight. And the atrocities he committed when genociding the fuck out of other people was something that should weigh far more deeply on him than they actually did. At the moment, however, they were a very distant feeling, something he almost wasn't even sure that was actually there. Which in my opinion added another layer to his character, because you were constantly questioning whether or not he was doing things because they were an emotionally and morally upstanding thing he wanted to do, or because he simply felt like he should be doing them. It also added more weight to the characters of both Rosa and Ryder, the little girl that he saves, because they were his emotional anchor in the original version of Final Fantasy IV, the people who were keeping him grounded when everything else was falling apart and he was slowly losing himself. And while not having this conversation certainly doesn't ruin the game, it was a majorly overlooked opportunity for some real character development later on. At the moment, they seem to have decided to tank the conversation in exchange for not adding anything at all, just removing things from the game in general. So great fucking job, Square Enix, you managed to fuck up one of the most importantly emotional scenes in the entire fucking game, especially something that gives context to the rest of it, you bunch of fucking wankers! This is why remakes of retro games are always a bit of a hit and a miss for me, because I always worry that the developers are going to take out things that I felt were very important without putting anything else back in, which in my opinion was exactly what happened here. However, again, by no means does this ruin the game overall, it just makes Square Enix a bunch of fucking wankers. Why yes, I am upset, how the fuck did you know? Stepping away from the story for a moment, the combat of Final Fantasy IV is turn-based, the gentlemanly way to do things. And with the combat being old school comes the fact that Final Fantasy IV also has a class system in which you will encounter all the Final Fantasy stereotypes which basically set the mold for the entire JRPG genre. Outside of the more Final Fantasy specific classes such as the Dark Knight and Dragoon, you'll also come across classes such as the Black Mage, the White Mage, the Monk, and the Bard. You'll notice I mentioned the Bard last because Edward, the Bard in this particular game, is fucking useless. Usually I wouldn't make such a big deal out of this, but RPGs require every character to bring something to the party, and other than being absolutely fucking useless, Edward brings absolutely nothing at all. Seriously, it's crazy. The guy has one useful skill which will give you a passive regen to your entire party, and it will continue to give that passive regen until either the spell itself runs out, or he gets attacked. Which I'll admit, out of the gate, does not sound that bad. The problem is that the enemies target down Edward at any given point, not only when he's playing that song, as if he murdered their fucking family and it's time for payback. It's insane! The dude has one useful spell and you will never be able to use it, ergo he is fucking useless. Again, I usually wouldn't harp on about this, but Final Fantasy requires you to have a balanced party, and Edward is just taking up more space than he really deserves to have. The space he deserves to have being a shallow grave in the middle of nowhere. But anyway, moving away from Edward, who as we have established is fucking useless, let's talk about some of the other characters in Final Fantasy IV. The ones you'll be meeting very early on in your journey, besides Cecil and Kain, are also Rosa, who is your White Mage, and Ryder, who is your Summoner. Later on in the game, you'll also come across Teller, who's a sage who has access to black and white magic. He will join the party for brief stints before he dies eventually. Oh, by the way, spoilers. However, I'm not really sure if that counts as a spoiler, because the game came out 16 years ago. You've had more than enough time to catch up. And even if the game hadn't come out over 16 years ago, a lot of the earlier Final Fantasies kill off characters. Granted, they don't always stay dead, a lot of them do come back due to Deus Ex Machina bullshit, which stinks of poor writing to me, but we'll leave that aside for now, the Deus Ex Machina part, not the bullshit part. I have more to say on that. As the game goes on, we find out that Kain is still alive and working for the Kingdom of Baron, which is now under the control of Golbez, a man who looks like he got lost on his way to a death metal concert. The problem with Golbez as a villain is not in fact his relationship to the main character. Him and Cecil are apparently brothers, and this adds a lot to the story. The problem with Golbez, along with Cecil, comes when we start diving into their backstory, and we discover that both of them come from a bunch of humans who live on the fucking moon! Oh, there you are, Square Enix. You know, I was really starting to enjoy this straightforward fight between good and evil, but I guess your writing staff just got off break. Seriously, fuck Square Enix's writing staff. Then again, I suppose we really should have taken this as an idea of where the series would be going in the future, because quite clearly Final Fantasy was destined to have its head shoved up its own asshole. And while they did manage to redeem it with Final Fantasy 15, this may have been an early warning sign that the series was going to spend several years sniffing its own farts. But when it comes down to it, I guess I really do like Final Fantasy IV, even if the main character does look like he's going for a casual bondage session at a death metal concert.